So this morning, panel 4, we're going to discuss governance for tea destinations and enterprises, a code of ethics. And the panel will run for about 65 minutes. And it features policy advisors and academic experts. I'm losing my mic. There we go. And I would like to welcome our panel chair, Handszuh, sitting already on the stage. It's ready. Henry's been sitting on the stage since 8 o'clock, ready to share his knowledge with us. He's a reader in international tourism and invited professor of Katowice School of Economics in Poland. Following his work in government agencies responsible for tourism in Poland and as a secretary of the International Tourism Commission of the country's members of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Professor Handszuh was an international civil servant of the United Nations World Tourism Organization from 1984 until 2007. Initially as an analyst in the studies section and ultimately as the director of the market department. He drafted major United Nations World Tourism Organization tourism policy documents and organized the UN WTO courses in all world regions in the fields of travel formalities, quality, trade, ethics, accessibility, health, and safety and security. Looking at this resume, I think he's an ideal candidate to lead this panel this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome your chair for this morning, Professor Henrik Handszuh.
Thank you, Matilda, for introducing me. Welcome to our panel 4 on governance and ethics. Let me introduce our panelists. I'm afraid there is one panelist still missing. I must tell you, I was very upset last night because she was coming, just before the big door was supposed to be open again, and I said, okay, I'll be back in 20 minutes. So should I stay with you? And I said, no, I will do it. I will arrange myself. And then she disappeared. She had come a long way from Greece. Well, we'll see whether she could still join us. Okay. So for the time being, let me introduce our competent panelists to this table. Raul Bianchi, an international traveler, never-tiring traveler, social scientist, specializing in the study of the politics and international political economy of tourism development in islands and coastal areas, tourism, travel rights and citizenship, tourism entrepreneurship and labor relations, sustainability, social justice, and ethics in tourism. He also worked on the issues of cultural heritage and world heritage. Principal regional focus is on Spain, the Mediterranean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. Raul could please join our table. Actually, I came across Raul through the International Sociological Association, which from time to time, reviews tourism issues, and it's a very important source of reference, in our thinking about tourism and research on tourism. Right, this is the missing panelist, Corina Miliaraki. She was supposed, and I hope she will still join us, to represent the industry, because really, talking about these issues of ethics, we need people from industry, and we chose this particular part of industry, small businesses and rural accommodation. There was some discussion on rural accommodation and rural tourism in presentations yesterday. So this could complement very much this debate, if she could be with us. So perhaps I won't present her now because she is not here, but you can read this, what she stands for. And if you find her, please, now you can at least, know who she is and encourage her to join us. Okay. Antje Monshausen, the Senior Policy Advisor and Head of Tourism Watch, Brood für die Welt, Bread for the World, has been with the Development Service of the Protestant Churches in Germany, now Bread for the World since 2008, in the Policy Department as well as in the International Program Department, member of the Certification Council of TourCert. TourCert, which certifies willing tour operators, whether they do things right. A very interesting initiative, which seems to be quite successful, and I hope Antje will tell us about this experience. So she is a board member of ECPAT, Germany, German contact point for the multi-stakeholder initiatives, a roundtable on human rights in tourism. Human rights, we are going to discuss human rights here, and therefore that's why Antje is with us. She holds a university diploma in geography with political science and public health as minor subjects and completed additional university training in regional studies, Latin America. All of us, we are also familiar with Latin America. It's interesting how it came about. But her research background is on community-based tourism and cooperation between local initiatives and tourism businesses. She authored articles and publications about tourism and local participation, corporate social responsibility in tourism, and tourism versus development. Antje, would you please take the floor? Finally, from Spain, Aurora Pedro, Associate Professor in the Department of Applied Economics of the University of Valencia, where she is a member of the Institute of International Economy. She has a close relationship to UNWTO. She is a vice chair of affiliate members committee of UNWTO. By the way, my university is also an affiliate member of UNWTO. Yeah, Aurora participates in different masters and postgraduate courses in tourism, and has different publications on tourism policy, tourism and development, competitiveness, and sustainability. She is academic director of the UNWTO University of a master strategy and management of sustainable tourism destinations, also the director of the UNWTO course, tourism and international cooperation for development, in 5 editions in Spanish. So, Aurora, please join us. So, this explicit and competent group will be my partners in this debate, which we hope will be engaging us all, and will engage not only in scientific terms but in emotional terms. Let me say a few words by means of introduction. Well, I don't know whether I should read everything what was said. Our fathers of the conference expect from us, they talk about the future of tourism, they talk about whether tourism can police itself, whether what tourism does should contribute to justice, international peace. These are the things referred to in the introduction to our panel. Well, perhaps we should first define issues, governance and development. this is what I distributed to our panelists before they came. Well, so this is what my note says. Our objective is to travel the road of means contributing to governance, of shared responsibility for tourism receiving areas. Actually, in the past, we didn't use the term destinations. We used the term tourism receiving areas. Actually, you can manage a territory not from outside, from the traveler point of view or tour operator's point of view, where we talk about destinations, the places where they go. So, in these areas where the beacon should be ethics, professed by whom? Professed by the tourism enterprise, whether private or public. Because of tourism, governance of an area becomes a postulate or imperative. There are new elements in an area. The presence of visitors from outside and the tourism enterprise, which perhaps was not there before. So therefore they are invited to assume their own share of responsibility for the area. So what is governance about? And here I quote what was said recently at the International Union of World Parks Congress in Australia, 2014. Governance is about who makes decisions and how decisions are made among all its stakeholders. Another Professor Eduardo Fayo Sola said that governance is collective action also, another definition, okay? So, who makes decisions and how decisions are made among all of its stakeholders. We speak of sound governance when decisions are taken legitimately, fairly, with a sense of vision, accountability, and while respecting rights. Sound governance amounts to respecting democratic principles. I think we should agree on this when making decisions. Economic growth. Yesterday we talked about development. We should perhaps also raise the issue of growth. Economic growth does not necessarily amount to development unless growth is inclusive. We talked about inclusive development. Our economy is based on the notion of growth, that we should grow continuously, otherwise there will be no development. It's all fine, okay? But therefore, this growth should also be inclusive. Sound governance indicates that conflicts among tourism stakeholders in a destination can be reduced or eventually eliminated. International peace and tourism destinations. So, who are the components of a tourist destination? So in addition to businesses, which I mentioned already, the enterprise, their organizations and visitors, destinations consist of local communities, their civil society organizations, and local governments. They all add up to make a society embedded in the environment, okay? And there's another interesting quote from the famous Michael Porter, His evolution is very interesting, and this is what he published in April this year. So he says, a society which fails to address basic human needs, equip citizens to improve the quality of life, protect the environment, and provide opportunity for many of its citizens, is not succeeding. If it is not succeeding, inclusive growth requires both economic and social progress. Perhaps or surely these are the conditions where tourism, international tourism in particular, can play a role in supporting and strengthening, although unfortunately, and I'm sorry to say that, not necessarily ensuring international harmony and peace. International tourism is not the main actor, in providing for international peace. If there is no peace, basically tourism suffers from such. situations. Okay, the issue of rights has been raised. The issue of rights, human rights, to be exact, the rights of all human beings to be enjoyed by all in an equitable manner is fundamental here. Basic human rights address basic human needs. Ethical behavior translates into respect of others' human needs, thus giving rise to natural and subjective rights, those fixed by law, into responsibilities and into accountability. Accountability for what? For the things done, and for the things, how they are done. Ethics shows in people's motivations, emotions, activities, and conduct towards other people. Ethics is upheld this way or another by religions. Ethics can also be enacted by law, requiring the state to intervene when the law is infringed or breached. Ethics is practiced. The quality of ethics manifests in the way how power relations are managed among people. Ethics is to do things right. Doing things right brings about more quality, such as more quality in tourism. Ethics equally takes interest in people's attitude towards the natural environment, which is a fundamental component of tourist destinations. The affected environment, as demonstrated by climate change and its consequences, backfires at all humans, especially the weakest. Degraded environment backfires at tourism destination attractiveness. Ethics, therefore, is a transcendent and a transversal issue. It appears and reappears under different names when approached from different perspectives, be it a global compact, that of the United Nations, corporate social responsibility, rules of conduct, good practice, global reporting initiatives, fair trade, specifically codes of conduct, respecting human rights, even sustainability and voluntary quality standards. These soft and social order encouraging recommendations or instruments are intended to support or supplement hard, legally binding rules, or to fill the vacuum in the absence of such rules. Why the claim of ethics in tourism? Because apparently people sense that ethics is largely not there. When enacting, and now I refer to my personal experience, when enacting the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism of 1999, the UNWTO had before it dozens of documents already from tourism-related constituencies claiming justice in tourism. To recall, the UNWTO Global Code of Ethics for Tourism was preceded by the Tourism Bill of Rights and Tourist Code of 1985, and also the Manila Declaration on World Tourism of 1980. The Manila Declaration made a special reference to education. What we believed, and I was one of the drafters of the declaration at the time, that tourism should be taught at primary schools, that young people should be prepared, to be responsible and ethical tourists. So we can look back and find out whether this recommendation has ever been followed. I'm afraid not. Okay. Recently, the UNWTO joined another initiative, which is the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, and subscribed to its criteria for tourist destinations. To recall, it all shows that sustainability has become fashionable, which is a very positive phenomenon. Okay, I could continue like this. I think what we have prepared will eventually, we can publish it on our paper. Let me now move, to inviting our speakers to take the floor. Okay. So, first, I would like to ask Antje to react to this to this statement. Your organization, Antje, Tourism Watch, which accompanied the World Tourism Organization in a number of seminars on the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism, now happily hanging on the UNWTO website. We can ask ourselves what is really, what it has delivered, okay? So, but it is there. So the organization, Antje, takes particular interest in respecting human rights in the least developed countries, hosting package tours and pleasure trips from Europe. Is it so that European law, or the law of tourism receiving countries, and the enforcement institutions concerned, both in Europe and elsewhere, are not good or sufficient enough in protecting human rights engaged in the production, distribution, and consumption of tourism products? Why do we need additional mobilization by civil society to this effect? And what is the outcome of such mobilization so far, as viewed by your organization? Have we received progress in this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Henrik, for inviting me to this panel and to bringing this important issue of governance to this audience, which I think is barely discussed in international conferences, the issue of governance concerning the state of law. I think what we have is, usually we have good laws. There are laws, but they are written on paper, and there's a huge lack in implementation and in effectively monitoring those laws and enforcement. We see at the same time that many laws are not reflecting the growth trends that we are having in tourism. So, for example, protection laws, when we are coming to protect areas, are not regularly monitored and adapted to the growth and the number of tourists that are coming and that are affecting those destinations. So the laws has to be monitored regularly, which is not the case very often. And we see that laws are very often concerning technical solutions. So let's talk about one issue, for example, agrofuels, which is mentioned as a green solution for mobility, for energy production. But it is, the laws are only addressing the national interests, so global issues are very hard to bring on the agenda, so issues in the field of agrofuels, of food sovereignty in the areas where the fuels are produced. The second question of yours concerning the role of civil society, I think they have a huge role to play in the destinations. First, in the documentation of human rights cases. We have a recent study from the German Technical Corporation, which is not published yet, but they looked at 120 documented human rights cases, and the majority of them were brought to attention by civil society. So this is a very important role civil society can play. And academia is part of the civil society in generally independent academia. I think a second issue is what we need is the principle of prior informed consent by the local population. This means not only having a consent, but being informed and having a say before tourism is coming to a place, to have a say in which kind of tourism the people really want and which role they want to play. So I think civil society has a role in educating, in raising awareness, and in giving knowledge about opportunities, but also about risks of tourism in the destinations. A third role is to change the perception that we are having in tourism. So overcoming the power structures, we see that local population very often has less bargaining power when they are sitting together with companies or with politicians. So to educate and give power in fields of advocacy, for example, is a very, very important issue. And to sum this up, and again, I'm also talking to academia as part of the civil society, they have to challenge this customer orientation that we do have in tourism business, where the customer is in the center of each and every decision. So we have security issues that are very high on the agenda, and we as civil society have to challenge this perspective to give a perspective on the people living in the destinations, because this is rarely the case in international governance or local governance of tourism. And you were also talking about the Global Code of Ethics. Just some sentences about this. I think in 1999 it was a very important document, a very important orientation, but it's unfortunately not a tool of governance as far as I can see, because it lacks implementation. And it is in many cases not very concrete. And the main weakness that we are seeing is the missing, or let's say dysfunctional dispute mechanism that we are having in paragraph 10 of the Global Code of Ethics, where the concerned partners have to come together to a specific physical place. And it's not very surprising that in the past there were not so many cases documented in front of the Global Committee of Tourism Ethics. So we ask for a review of the Global Code of Ethics in the light of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. As you may be aware, is that companies are now also signing the Global Code of Ethics. So the fundamental principles on business and human rights has to be adopted and brought into a review process of the Global Code of Ethics.
Okay, thank you, Antje. I think we will go back to some of the points you have raised. Well, on my left, I have Raul. Raul, in your research, publications, teachings, your principal focus appears to be the traveler. I understand the socially awakened, informed, empathic, and responsible tourism consumer as citizen, the protagonist, as we dreamt of such a protagonist in the Manila Declaration on World Tourism, 1980. You invoke the concept of global citizenship. Citizenship awareness is foremost as outcome of education, which we also affirmed in 1980. It can be also supported by law. Law largely looks into consumer protection, which advises people of the rights, in particular economic rights. No? Let's have a look at European legislation on this subject. It's very much about this issue, economic rights. Is there a scope for law, international, European, national, to foster global citizenship through the area of international travel and tourism? How do we see realistically the role of global citizenship in tourism in contributing to international peace and justice? Citizenship in tourist destinations also applies a role for local citizens who constitute host communities, both in developed and developing countries. Some of these citizens may angrily react to abuse caused by incoming tourism, while on the other hand they are expected to be hospitable and welcoming. I would like to quote two examples, just from last month and recent months. An example from Isla de Pascua, Easter Island, Rapa Nui, a Chilean island lost in the Pacific. Local citizens blocked access to all tourism attractions because the situation became entirely unsustainable, and they couldn't agree with the central government about the type of tourism, the type of access, the type of settlements, which in a liberal and free economy were, just upsetting and changing entirely the authenticity of this place, which the local citizens, there are only 4,000 people living there, could not agree to. Also in Barcelona, in Spain, the local residents took to the streets, to protest, the abuse caused by visitors, the way they behaved. And I remember that Barcelona has always been quoted as a successful, well-managed, and attractive tourist destination. So these are my concerns. Raul, could you address some of my questions?
Thank you, Henrik. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all, and thank you very much for inviting me to this fascinating forum with so many eminent and interesting speakers, not least on this panel. And thank you, Henrik, for this really detailed paper that you sent last week or the week before, which is very well thought out and asks so many questions which I don't know if we are going to be able to answer all of them this morning, but I'll make a stab at it. Before I go directly to a couple of your points, I'll just say that a couple of things, if I may, about my focus. It is specifically to do with political economy and power and market relations and the transformation of communities through development. Although, of course, the traveller or the tourist is always implicated in that process. And more recently, I have indeed begun to look at that in the context of this notion of citizenship, and particularly global as well as cosmopolitan citizenship. These are two interrelated areas of philosophical thought. They go right back, of course, to the Cynics, to Diogenes, who used to live in Sinop. Interestingly enough, Sinop is on the tentative list to be a World Heritage Site in northern Turkey. And of course the Stoics, many of whom used to travel down here to Naples 2,000 years ago. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman philosopher, of course, was a Stoic philosopher, and in his writings he would write following the Cynic notion of giving up material belongings. So at the core of citizenship in terms of global citizenship, it goes right back to that notion of living without the need for material belongings. And living in a life of selflessness. So I think those are two sort of interesting notions that I've sort of kicked around in my writings on tourism and citizenship to think about, how are these sort of stitched into the fabric of global travel, if indeed at all, as well as the architecture of rights and ethics, as you rightly say, Henrik, of course, in the Manila Declaration, and the WTO Code of Ethics of '99, which I'll probably say something about a little bit later, because there's quite interesting contrast between those two documents separated by 19 years. So on to citizenship and tourism. I think this is a really difficult area. I mean, I don't see tourism as necessarily being a pathway to citizenship, although it's often seen as such, particularly the rise of volunteering and volunteer tourism. It's very much part and parcel of giving oneself to usually poor communities in what we once called the Third World, or emerging states, as we now tend to know some of them. And indeed, there have been a number of interesting studies on volunteer tourism, some of which conducted by an organisation I've been involved with for 20 years, which is Tourism Concern, a UK-based NGO and campaigning organisation that has campaigned for fair trade, ethical travel, and so on, and has indeed worked with Anya and colleagues in the past. And so there's been research sort of looking at some of the inconsistencies of the discourse and the practice of volunteering. Yes, in many ways it's better than what we might call conventional mass tourism, but that's something else I'd like to come back to later perhaps. But in many ways it reproduces the same problems. It doesn't challenge the power inequalities and the inequalities of wealth which enable that relationship to take place. Perhaps it's too early to say. Tourism is, as we know it, as a kind of an industrial commercial industry, is very young, although it goes back to perhaps, I always like to tell my students, 1841, the first mass tour from sort of Loughborough to Leicester in the Midlands. I'll come back to Thomas Cook later, very important figure actually in his writings. So perhaps it's too early to say. But I think we do need to kind of do, and I'm kind of prefiguring some of your questions later, Henrik, we need to look more into these relationships that are emerging in what we might call niche or specialist travel, or indeed what I've seen more recently referred to as philanthropic travel. So there's a kind of an ethico-philanthropic movement, if you like, in tourism. And it's really interesting that tourism as an industry, inverted commas, because, as we know, Neil Leeper famously contested that notion of tourism as an industry. He referred to it as industries. Michael Hall refers to tourism as a form of partial industrialization. And that's what's so fascinating about it, because it does then bring us to these other sort of more core values of peace, justice, intercultural dialogue, and so on and so forth. We don't refer to the car industry as promoting intercultural dialogue necessarily in the same sort of way that we look at tourism. So it's really interesting that, you know, why does this phenomenon sort of attach itself to these sorts of values? Very quickly on education, yes, indeed, citizenship must be part of education, but I don't think it's a necessary outcome of it, because citizenship for me is something that arises out of social and political praxis. And you know, civil, political, and of course social and economic rights come as a result of social, political action. It's a political right that's often taken from elites, and of course civil society, as Annie was just talking about, is very much part of that process now. So it's in a sense, it's moved out of the workplace into the wider world. And that's hence we see these sorts of movements in Easter Island and in the Canary Islands, where I've worked for 20 years looking at social movements and environmental movements, very much part and parcel of that. Peace and justice very quickly, and then I want to end on Barcelona. That's an interesting example, which I think goes to the heart of the problem. Yeah, how much time have we got? I mean, tourism and peace. Yeah, we know that it's constantly in vogue. Louis de Moore set up the International Institute for Peace through Tourism. There are many sort of what I would see as rather vacuous proclamations, unfortunately, around tourism and its ability to, its intrinsic ability. That's important, that it's intrinsically able to foster peace. It can, of course, facilitate that given the right conditions. And there are many examples, indeed South Africa, in terms of heritage and reconciliation, and using tourism as a tool of both political reconciliation but also social and economic readjustment. I've worked in the West Bank. I continue to work in the West Bank. I've taught at University of Bethlehem. I've worked with tour organizations, undertaking all sorts of what we might call justice tourism activities in the West Bank, working, of course, across that very fractious and divisive border or borders between Palestinian entities and Israeli entities, and of course in the wider Middle Eastern area. Barcelona. Yeah, that's a very interesting case study. I think there were a couple of Italians, actually, who took their clothes off and ran down the streets of Barceloneta, and it sort of triggered the protest. Now, the protest was specifically focused on Airbnb. And Airbnb, I've been to a number of meetings in London hosted by the Financial Times and other organizations on the so-called sharing economy, which we'll maybe come back to later on. And it's deeply problematic, that notion, and the new sort of digital economy. And there's a sense that, it's eradicating the sort of previous inequalities and contradictions of what we might call traditional capitalism. But actually, in many cases, it's not. It's reinforcing them. If you just take bookings.com, it controls 40 to 45% of the European market. It's 45 billion euros, the European hotel and travel booking market. It is owned by Priceline, which is valued at 70 billion. I'm not sure if it's US dollars or euros. And they are, of course, very aggressive operators, the OTAs, and very aggressive particularly at tax avoidance, not evasion, but tax avoidance, and have taken, I think, the Hawaiian state authorities to court, Maryland, and many other organizations to try and sort of, wiggle their way out of tax regulations at the expense of what we might call the traditional hospitality providers. And I know the British Hospitality Association in London is deeply concerned about Airbnb and other OTAs. I think I'll maybe stop there, Henrik, otherwise I'll just go on and on.
Great. Thanks a lot, Raul. Now, Aurora, our professor from the University of Valencia. Well, our focus continues to be the tourism destination and its governance. I mentioned hard legal standards, which are there. Some of them allude to ethical issues or carry an ethical content. For example, here we can talk about labor standards, occupational safety, food safety, and we have in place a number of public institutions auditing tourism establishments for such standards or certifying. From time to time, in lifts, we see that this, has been checked. So this is part of it, and of course, ensuring safety is also. It carries an ethical content, right? At the same time, we have a number of these soft, voluntary, standards, recommendations. You should behave this way. It should be done this way. You have devised a very interesting term, which it says ethical tourism destinations. Not sustainable tourism, ethical tourist destinations. Perhaps, perhaps we, among all of us, we could launch this term as something new and something going to the core. So again, perhaps if a destination can claim to be ethical, it should also be certified. And if we want certification, it should go by certain, parameters or indicators. Could you? There are many models how to do it. I remember from my practice, for example, the ISO model for standards is also very interesting. How we could check on compliance with what we claim we represent. Could you explain, your view on this and where we stand, and whether there is whether it is feasible, indeed, to certify, and also, having in mind, the WTO Global Code of Ethics for Tourism, because some entities, even some countries, they say we commit ourselves to the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism, but what about accountability for compliance with the code principle if we don't have a system in place? So, okay, please, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Henrik, for inviting me and organize the committee for inviting me to this panel. I would like to, to make a reflection, first from different points of views. For example, as a professor in the University of Valencia, as a member of the academy that is involved in educational, in educating the next generations, there is something that was very surprising for me at the beginning when I began to teach in tourism. Well, I come from the I'm economist, and in economy, when we studied economy, we did not study what we call impacts, negative impacts. We just assume that we have to solve the problems. But in tourism, there is something that we repeat to the students once and again. There are social, cultural impacts, environmental impacts, economic impacts, etc. This is really interesting, because we begin teaching that tourism has negative impacts, and of course we have to solve them. But we talk about them. And still we are talking about them. Of course, in economy, for example, we have an interest in the way we act in the market. As you know, there are some subjects that we have introduced in the last years, like ethics for market. And it's, it's doing the same, it's happening the same in tourism. We have considered what is happening in markets and the ethical question. At least in my university, we have special subjects on ethics and markets. And that's quite interesting too. Do we need to explain the students the need for ethical performance? Well, this is from, from one point of view. As an economist, I will do an economic thinking about the question of the global code of ethics. Usually, we always accept that, of course, the market is the main institution. We have to interchange services, in this case, information. We work in this paradigm. We accept that way of distributing. But the question is, of course, and this is a very old question in economy, that markets are not perfect. That's why we have norms and we have laws. So the question I wanted to point out is, we are talking about externalities and public goods. So in economy, this is a very old question. If we have externalities and public goods, the authorities, public authorities, they have to do something. Some years ago, the most, well, the way they act were with hard legal norms and hard legal standards, if we want to say that. But this have been changed in the last years. We know, there is a reaction against strong public intervention. So we have more liberalized markets, and we have reduced, or we have made softer norms to develop activities in the market. What does it mean? It means that we have changed hard laws and we have introduced a kind of softer norms, believing that the private actors will accept them and will act in a certain way. That's why we have standards. We have environmental standards, quality standards, and in the case of the Code of Ethics, we have an ethical standard. But the question is that the other tools, we have seen some uncertain evolution. For example, in quality standards, we have ISO criteria. And for example, environmental standards, we have the blue flag as an example. We could talk about more examples. But what have we done with the Global Code of Ethics? Well, of course, something has been done. The information about the Global Code of Ethics has been fostered from UNWTO, especially in those educational institutions that are technical institutions, and I can talk because I'm involved in that program too. I was explaining, Henry, that he had no information about that, but in the last certification changes we made in UNWTO for technical institutions, one of the questions that has been developed more is the Global Code of Ethics in educational institutions. So, again, we explain when the students come for the first years that tourism has a lot of impacts, social, economics, environmental impacts. Then we explain them that we have something called Global Code of Ethics. Some institutions have made special panels and they put in the classrooms or in the main entrance. They explain, and we ask them to explain to students what is Global Code of Ethics about. But by the moment, this is all we have done. Of course, destinations have signed special agreements to respect the Global Code of Ethics. State members also, and some firms. That's very important, but the question is, but what are they doing? How do we know that it's working or not? So if we want to make this UNWTO initiative of Global Code of Ethics, I think we will have to work a little bit more. The question of indicators is interesting because it's the only way we have to follow certain performances. So we have to establish some standards, and I think it could be a very good idea to try to develop at least what I don't know if Angie said we have to initiate a review process of the global code of ethics. The idea of developing some indicators, some standards, and the idea of knowing what's happening, and not only in developing destinations, new destination, new tourism destination, but also in consolidated destination. My colleague was talking about Barcelona, if I understood, because I cannot hear you very well from here, but I had that Barcelona as a good example, and also the Balearic Islands with the problems they had with the salary for certain human resource in hotel industry. So what's happening and how are we trying to act in those negative situations? Well, I think UNWTO could have a very good role in this process of review global code of ethics, and just to talk about standards and some kind of indicators just to know what's happening in the world.
Thank you, Aurora. Well, I would like to give a warm welcome to our fourth panelist, who has just arrived. And yes, and I immediately, I will. Here she is. You can read what she's about. She's Secretary General of the Hellenic Agrotourism Association, and. Corina, you have devised also evaluation criteria, for your members, and there are many members all over Greece who sit on this association, and I understand these evaluation criteria by which they judge themselves allude or refer to ethical values. So the question to you would be, after perhaps you want to say a few words about your association, which is also part of the European Association, Eurogit, by the way, headquartered in Spain, in Murcia. So, what are the evaluation criteria for rural tourism, and why you have chosen them? Why did you feel it was necessary?
Okay. As you said, we are owners of rural tourism, small-scale enterprises.
Could you please speak closer to the microphone? Yes, very close, because otherwise in the room we don't hear, and of course
So we are rural tourism and agrotourism in a small scale, owners of rural tourism enterprises of small scale. We try to develop infrastructure with gentle interventions and promote the traditional culture. Until now, we work in two levels. At a high level, and for the last 10 months, we work on finalizing and lawmaking the formal framework for rural tourism in Greece, which needs a lot of study and very good cooperation with all our members. At a lower level, and from the start of the union, we configure the criteria that the company should satisfy in order to be evaluated as an agrotourism or rural tourism member. So what are these criteria? They have been selected in order to ensure compliance with the ethics of tourism and the morality imposed by the culture and history of Greece. So first of all, each criterion hides behind one or more ethical cultural values. First, it should be a small-scale enterprise. This is very important for us, the size, because only through a small-sized one, the traveler can receive respect of the uniqueness and diversity and feel real hospitality. the owner of, or members of the family enterprise must work in this. So they must have a personal relationship. The business facilities should be architecturally harmonized with traditional architecture, and this combined with their small size ensures that it will coexist with the natural environment and will not introduce violently into it. Also, any alternative tourism activities should highlight and protect the natural beauty of the land. The energy saving standards is another criteria. And the promotion of local products also. These are some of the very few basic criteria we have. So the small size is the most important, and the and the owner must be in the enterprise to work in this. I want to emphasize that our attitude does not see our visitors only as clients and ourselves and as entrepreneurs who use any means to make any profit, economic benefit from this. Instead of what? We see them as guests, and our aim is that our relationship will be designed in the name of humanity and will highlight its best option, culture and ethics. By highlighting promotion of best features and achievements of our and their tradition, we finally become better people. So we don't see it from one side only, but as an exchange of experience. And according to the approach and attraction of the traveler, we place great emphasis on outward looking of the Union, and that's why we're members of Eurozit, trying to...
Okay, thank you, Corina, for your testimony. Well, a very short round of additional questions. Antje, our interest is in your work with tour operators. No, you have you work with tour operators, who joined an institution which is called Round Table Human Rights in Tourism. These two tour operators come from Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. You know, and there is a certification system. No, it is to continue on what Aurora was telling us. Any comments on how successful it is? Very briefly, and
yeah.
But this is the way forward.
Okay, very briefly. So I will not go to it into detail, but I'm open to discuss it at lunch or whatsoever. I have some documents with me, so whoever wants to know more can come and we can talk. Well, the certification is one thing. I think the value in tourism as a selling argument is very little, as all studies are showing. But I think as a management tool, it's very, very important. So we believe in company certification and not in product certification. This is what we are doing with TourCert, which is a GSTC, Global Sustainable Tourism Council recognized certification scheme for tour operators. Coming to the Roundtable Human Rights in Tourism, I also think this is a management issue, and we have an important change. We see an important change from reactive management if something is going wrong, if there is an incident, an accident whatsoever, to risk management, so to assess risks and to avoid bad effects of the own economic activities. So this is a huge change, which is a challenge, because in risk management you can hardly have a cost relation scheme in advance to say, well, this is the price if you want to react on a specific risk. So this is one thing that is challenging inside the companies. I think the companies is one angle, and what we discussed in the first round, that we need governance, that we need laws for accountability, for reporting, and so on is very important, and this means that we need to implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights into national law, so that we can come forward not only with the committed companies that are existing, but also with the big companies who are the main actors when we are looking at global tourism.
Okay, thank you. I think it clarifies nicely the situation and shows us the way forward. Raul, corporate social responsibility, and well, it is claimed that going by such institution accrues benefits at the end of the day, the tangible economic benefits to the practice in company, at least the mid and long term, and also competitive advantages, image. So the same should apply to tourism enterprises. We have myriads of tourism enterprises, and actually they go by short-term, considerations. They want financial gain, perhaps at any cost, So therefore, it appears that we need a special public, to demand services of ethical tourism companies who claim to respect social, corporate social responsibilities. We need, I call it the willing, the faithful, the elite, the financial, the intellectual elite. Well, how do you see this situation? And it doesn't ethics become also, doesn't it become commercial?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Henrik. Absolutely.
A commodity, okay?
Maybe I'm rather jaded, given that I live in London, and it's probably the centre of the most unethical capitalism one could possibly imagine. But I think, of course, CSR, and again, with Tourism Concern, we worked on that. We produced a report some years ago, and now there's a sort of a working group of tour operators and enterprises, sort of an ethical tourism working group to try to sort of thrash out these sorts of issues. But I think there's sort of a limit to what can be achieved by individual enterprises, and it's almost unfair to burden them with that responsibility, and one has to see it within a totality of relations within an economic system, and work at all these different levels. And I think we need to disentangle ethics from competitive advantage, because in many cases, as we well know, it stops there. It becomes a brand, as you've quite rightly said, and it becomes a commodity. And then we can unburden ourselves of all the other sort of complex questions in terms of tackling poverty, social justice, inequality, and the structural problems in terms of advancing prosperity, which is what I prefer to use a term like prosperity as opposed to growth. Of course, there's all sorts of problems with growth as well. If one reads the sort of ecological economics and what is called steady state economics, which is a growing field of sort of political economy. And I've seen this as a campaigner as well as an academic, campaigning on ethical fair trade tourism, particularly with regards to Burma in the 1990s, but also other parts of the world, Goa, East Africa. There is an inbuilt contradiction in ethical tourism. In fact, a former student of mine partially wrote the Ethical Travel Guide that was published in the early 2000s. But there's an inbuilt contradiction there because it presupposes that one has the means to be a consumer in the first place. And that's all very well, but many of us don't. And many of us want to go to Benidorm for 2 weeks, myself included. And so one has to look at that end of the spectrum and not place ethics at the sort of eco-responsible tourism end of the spectrum. And I think we tend to ignore that. And the capacity and the potential for generating new, more egalitarian, more sustainable forms of tourism exists within the larger infrastructure of tourism, often than it does within the small, precarious enterprises that operating in many different parts of the world. From my own perspective, when I did research in the Canary Islands in the early 2000s, there was a moratorium on tourism development, But in the island of Gran Canaria, whose tourism enterprise base is predominantly 3-star apartments, self-catering apartments, it utterly wiped them out because they were unable to adjust to the new norms that were required as part of a so-called push towards sustainable quality tourism and the restriction on tourism development to 4- and 5-star resorts, which allowed large companies, Canary Island-based companies, particularly construction consortia, to benefit from that. So we need to look again, as I say, at the structure of the economics and the political economy behind what we talk about when we talk about ethical tourism. Indeed, there's a company or a resort in Lake Garda in the north of Italy, I can't remember the name, but it was recently voted as the most sustainable company in Italy by TripAdvisor. But it deals to supermodels and sort of elite tourists. It's very, very expensive to stay there. So I think that's the problem I see with ethical consumption. It's only part of the solution. It's not to ditch it, but it's only part of the solution.
Thank you. Again, it clarifies, and I thank you especially for illustrating, the issue with examples. 5 minutes. Left, asking perhaps we should ask some questions from the floor. I have some very general questions which are important for the future of our tourism network. So one question is, what avenues of research do you recommend to teach ethics or to promote ethics in tourism and transmit social knowledge to tourism stakeholders? This is one. Why tourism should be in the vanguard of teaching ethics to the world? Why we are so much concerned? There are so many other businesses, and we say, oh, we are the ones, to be sustainable, to be right, to be fair. And also, perhaps, from your perspective and experience, what are the most acute breaches of ethics in world tourism? Okay, so these are the questions, and perhaps the floor could join me in posing questions for the time we have left with us for our round table. Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay. Very quickly. Well, most acute breaches of ethics, there are many, of course. Sex tourism being the worst end of the spectrum, which is still rampant in many parts of the world. But I think, at risk of repeating myself, the gross inequalities of wealth, which is not necessarily tourism's fault, but tourism's part of an economic system within which these inequalities prevail and to some extent enable it to prosper, leads to, at the other end, ethical and human rights abuses, I think. So there's a connection between the two, so we can't see one in isolation from the other. Tourism at least does bring the privileged, and we are as tourists privileged and the better off, into direct contact with the less privileged in a way that buying a car, buying a computer doesn't. And I think that's very valuable and sort of a lesson we should remember. In terms of knowledge transfer, at risk of being a heathen or an apostate, as Albert Einstein said, I think knowledge is overrated and imagination is something we should continue to have. I don't mean to dismiss the point about knowledge transfer, but I think we need to imagine new futures before we can sort of easily transfer knowledge. And there's a tendency to sort of assume we have this sort of knowledge and we just have to kind of transfer it in bite-sized chunks. And so I see very much, certainly from my position as an academic, part of this process is trying to imagine new futures for tourism that can contain all these sorts of new ethical pathways.
Thank you. The points are well taken. Someone else would like to add, maybe from the floor or Abroda, you want to please?
Yeah, just
just depends on Matilda.
It's fine. Just an additional comment, to get a success in some of this action, when trying to introduce ethical components or ethical standards or ethical destinations, something like that, we have to think carefully about on the benefits and the costs. If the benefits are not clear or the costs are not clear, it will not become successful, a successful action. So the question is, why do we have, for example, I don't know, why is the Blue Flag campaign successful, and why we have hetero-friendly hotels or homosexual friendly hotels, and why are they, being successful? We have to think in those, in that direction. If we can increase the benefits of that kind of action, I think we will begin, to walk in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I would really like to open the floor just for one or two questions to the panelists. If there's anybody, we have some roaming mics. Can you just maybe put up your hands if there's any questions? Yeah. Okay, here in front, please. Thanks. Professor Okamos.
Good morning. Thank you very much for all your insights. We have so many policies, codes, rules, laws, regulations, but as you mentioned, they are not followed. What can we do to make sure that they are implemented and we follow all these rules, codes, ethics, whatever, regulations? Thank you.
I think the implementation, especially on the local ground, is lacking. So what we need is empowerment of the people to monitor unsustainable tourism development and advocacy capacities on the local ground. This is also important because what you said, that we don't know about the cost for unsustainable behavior has to be higher. I'm coming from a country where the aviation sector is supported by 10 billion euros a year. So the more sustainable modes of transport are not supported in that way, which is giving a competitive advantage to unsustainable behavior, and this is what we are seeing. So I think the the assessment of the costs of unsustainable behavior is very important, and I think economic research is important. And this too, the empowerment on the local ground, as well as hard economic facts on costs of impacts of tourism, negative and positive, is important and necessary.
Yeah. Could I solicit a speaker from the floor?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it appears that among our audience we have one member of the World Committee on Tourism Ethics. Tanya, would you like to say a few words, how you view the situation, because you have this privilege on being on this Global Code of Ethics?
Thank you. Thank you for this very good discussion and the panelists, and you were mentioning the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism. I'm not aware of the initiative that you are demanding to rewrite the code, and I didn't well understood what's the main problem with the code, the implementation of the code, or did you refer to the text of the code, which is basically what we as a society were able to achieve. But I do agree that there is a weak point in the implementation. But regarding to the Article 10 of the Code of Conduct, that is the base for the World Committee on Tourism Ethics and World Committee of Tourism Ethics, I think this is one of the structures that we do have at the global level that have the capacity to help us to implement the global citizenship at the global level. And maybe we should put our forces together to make it more operational. But I am hearing these 2 days at this conference, implementation is a problem, implementation is a problem. Even when we are talking about the legislation, which is supposed to have a mechanism to be implemented, we have the problem when we are talking ethics and sustainability for a known reason that have been addressed by this panel. So I think that we really should work on strengthening our forces, critical mass, achieving the power for the implementation. But in this regard, the committee is responsible to promote, to implement and to monitor the implementation of the Code of Conduct. And just I would like to add, I'm coming from the Faculty of Economics, which is TETQUAL certified, and yes, the Global Code of Ethics in Tourism is in the appendix of our school books. So we do disseminate and we do promote the Code of Ethics. And also the private sector commitment to the global code, I think it's a step forward. We just need to use it. And in this regard, the committee is also developing a kind of quasi-indicators, because all the signatures, all the companies that sign this private sector commitment, they need to report to the committee what they have done in order to implement the code. So maybe small steps further, but I think there is the structure for the global responsibility and citizenship. But I do agree that this tourism industry is alarmingly unsustainable and moving too slow. So what can we do? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we need to stop the panel at the moment. I think it's very relevant topics and something that should be addressed in more detail, maybe at a later stage, tea time, lunchtime, dinner time. Thank you, Professor Handszuh and his panelists, for your discussion.